with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Police forces everywhere face scrutiny as never before. And even as they're called upon to take on pandemic-related duties, what belongs under their purview is now being hotly debated. How should the role of police evolve? And who should keep society safe? We're exploring that tonight. Then we'll find out about some new technologies, including what's called predictive policing, and why the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab wants governments to exercise caution. It's Tuesday, September 29th, and that's next on the agenda. Events in the U.S. and here have recently prompted perhaps an unprecedented conversation about the role of police in society. It's not something anyone has all the answers for, but in the search for solutions, we've got a smart bunch assembled to shed light on all of it for us. And so, as is our custom here on the agenda, we introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our station, beginning in Calgary, Alberta, with Chad Haggerty, formerly an RCMP officer, currently a student at law with Craig Hooker-Shiskin Criminal Defence. In London, Ontario, Stephen Williams, Chief of the London Police Service. And here in the provincial capital, in downtown Toronto, Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. And in the Witchwood neighbourhood, here in Midtown Toronto, Farida Adam, staff lawyer at the Black Legal Action Centre. And it's good to welcome all of you onto TVO tonight. And Chief Williams, you won't be surprised to hear that I want to start with you. It's been about 4 months since the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota that launched a kind of a racial reckoning around policing. Do you think the role of the police since then has changed? And if so, how?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not so sure the role of the police per se has changed in the last several months. Certainly the conversation has started into what we should, could, or shouldn't be doing. I think there's always going to be a need for those core services provided by police services with relation to crime prevention, law enforcement, emergency response, things like that. That's what the community expects, and that's what we're legislated to provide to citizens. But the conversation is clearly about those gray areas. So we've talked a lot about mental health, homelessness, addiction, issues like that, which is a bit of a gray area. We are, in many communities across the province and across the country, the only 24/7 response when people need assistance. And quite often when our officers attend calls for service, these issues are at play. And police may not always be the most appropriate response. So that's where the conversation is heading, as to how we can more effectively deal with these issues that intersect with criminal justice, but may not be a criminal justice problem.
And I do want to follow up on that part of the conversation. But before we get there, one thing surely has changed. And that is, I think we've been doing this program 15 years. You may be the first active police officer on this program, not in uniform. I think every chief we've had on in the past has always wanted to wear the uniform. And interestingly enough, you chose not to today. How come?
Well, interesting question. You know, I'm aware of the uniform, and I take a lot of pride in what the uniform means to myself as a 28-year officer, and what it represents for policing, which I'm very proud of. But I know the uniform is also not always perceived in that light by many others. And one thing that I message to my staff and out in the community is that, you know, we're human beings, we're citizens, and we're regular people as well. So, you know, it's okay to show that, and sometimes the way that manifests is wearing a suit or wearing, you know, civilian clothing. And so that's part of the decision. But by no means am I not proud of the uniform, and I do wear it on a almost daily basis.
Not the most important question I'm going to ask tonight, but I thought it was an interesting choice on your behalf, which is why I just wanted to touch on it for a moment. Chad, you're the only other former officer here with us this evening, and so let me go to you second. You heard the chief give a bit of a list there of things that are being rethought right now, how the police do what they do. Do you think, generally speaking, we ask the police to do too much?
Absolutely. I think that police officers are going into situations that they don't have the proper training for. In many instances, dealing with those individuals who are suffering with mental health issues or addictions issues, other life issues that aren't generally in the purview of police officer duties, or shouldn't be. They currently are. And there are things, as the chief said, that police officers need to do and only police officers can do. In the last 4 months, we've had a lot of talk about defunding police and limiting what they do and using some of the police budget to fund other agencies to do things that they should be doing. We haven't seen any substantive change in any police force across Canada. They're still trying to maintain the sphere of influence that they have.
Farida, I'll go to you next. We have, as Chad rightly just suggested, we've heard efforts to have the police reformed. We've heard efforts to have the police defunded. We've even had, in some circumstances, efforts to have the police abolished entirely. Which path are you inclined to be on?
You know, I think from our perspective, when we're talking about dealing with what's happening to the Black community and the Indigenous community in terms of Black death, the loss of Black life, I think the Black Legal Action Center is closer to the spectrum of transforming the policing as we know it in this province. So that does include defunding the police, meaning taking resources away from the police and investing them in agencies who may be better equipped to use. And I think part of that also includes reimagining police. So it's not just about militarizing, it's not about dismantling, it's also about thinking about our relationship with each other and getting to the roots of how we address things like crime. What are our concepts of justice? What are our concepts of fairness? And so, yeah, from the Black Legal Action's perspective, it's a bus conversation, but we definitely adhere to the defund position.
Kwasi, maybe you could follow up on that and help us understand what we mean, because I have certainly heard activists say we need to defund the police as a means of punishing them. In other words, taking away responsibilities from them. On the other hand, I have heard the expression defund the police used meaning the police just are not the best people to carry out this function, and therefore we need to take that money not to punish police, but to more appropriately spend it on others who can better perform those tasks. Help us understand what your understanding of what all of this means.
Well, I think we're hearing all of the things that you've said and more. And I particularly appreciate a term that one of my colleagues kind of lended to me, which is actually detasking the police. I think, what we've acknowledged is that the police are doing too much and that their budgets reflect that. And we want to take away some of those tasks. And importantly, we know that when we have the police engage in activities that they're not the best organization or institution to engage in, we have a number of negative consequences that might flow from that. One being the criminalization of people that might not otherwise be criminalized. So we can think about this in the context of homelessness with respect to drug use when we've got police in schools, but also, of course, in relation to the use of force as well. So I particularly I'm using the term, and in the work that I'm doing in the area, use detasking the police, which recognizes that we're going to, take some of the tasks away from the police, and that there will be a corresponding reduction in the police budget to go along with that. And this isn't new. This has been acknowledged by the Canadian Associations of Chiefs of Police. This has been acknowledged by the Canadian government and in other Western nations long before the current conversations around defunding the police emerged as they have now.
Chief Williams, given the way that it has just been described by Kwasi, are you on side with that kind of transformation?
Well, I love the word detask, and our last speaker was quite correct that it has been discussed about at the CACP level and in the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police level, provincially. And mental health is a really good example of a file that the police did not ask for, but again, as the only, quite often the only 24/7 response, it falls into our lap. And we have said for a number of years that police are not always the appropriate agency to respond to many of these calls with adequate support from the provincial level, then maybe these calls wouldn't come to us in the first place. But as it sits right now, many of these calls for service, from what we hear through our community partners, there is still a role for the police often to attend in some capacity. Not always, but often there is. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a police-led response, though. So, the partnerships with the community and the, a health-led response for many of these calls for service is entirely appropriate. And that's the direction we need to head in. And we would hope that would result in corresponding savings within our budget as our officers are redeployed to those core policing needs that I spoke about.
Kwasi, let me come back to you on the quest for consensus here. In the days after the George Floyd, killing, murder, call it what you want, in the days after that, the Minneapolis City Council actually voted to defund the police significantly. And there seemed to be a consensus around that among activists, the community, and the political leadership at the time. You have subsequently seen in the last few weeks a significant attempt by the Minneapolis Council to reverse its decision, saying that they made the decision in haste or they didn't quite understand the full implications of what they were suggesting. All of which is to say, this clearly is more complicated than at first blush. I want to know from you where you see overlapping interests between police, community, political leadership. Do you see a sweet spot of consensus anywhere?
Well, I think the consensus should be that all of those parties play a role in fostering, public and community safety. And I think the decision to roll back, the reduction in the proposed cuts was simply a fact of not having examined the situation closely enough. Here in Toronto, we had a motion before City Council to defund the police by 10%. And while I'm fully in support of a reduction in funds, I think that this needs to be done in a sensible manner. And as a social scientist, I would first want to see, exactly what it is that the police are doing that they shouldn't be and what agencies are there to fill that void or which need to be created. And in order to do that, we'd need to examine police calls for service. We need to examine the budgets. And until we do that, and we do a bit of asset mapping to see what is out there to fill this void, we can't just, ad hoc or at whim decide to cut a police budget by 25 or 50%. The goal should be a reduction in those budgets. And as I've said, the removal of some of the tasks and functions, but we need to do this in a sensible, a thoughtful and careful manner so as not to further, jeopardize public and community safety.
Farida, can I get your view on that, on whether it's possible to find a consensus among political leadership, community leadership, police leadership? Is that doable?
I think it's doable if we center the people who are being disproportionately impacted by police brutality and violence. So if we start there and say we are talking about transforming the system, not only in terms of policing folks as we understand it traditionally, but including child welfare, including having police officers in schools, if we're saying we're starting with a lens that focuses on Indigenous communities, that focuses on Black communities, I think that we can start with, we can come to a consensus there. So if we start from a position of care, then we can sort of think about what sustainably and intelligently can we do in order to address some of these issues meaningfully.
Chad, I need to get you to weigh in on this because, of course, we do hear some voices that say abolish the police altogether. And we hear other voices saying that's ridiculous. When there's a break-in at your home, you got to call somebody. Where do you find the sweet spot of consensus with two such divergent views?
I think it's important to realize that, as everybody seems to agree, there is a role for police in society. One of the things that we're overlooking is the conversation can't be a fair conversation until police have appropriate oversight. At present, police budgets are hidden from view, police leadership and management hidden from view. Police acts across Canada, including the RCMP Act federally, need to be revamped and changed so that the average public person, the average citizen, has the ability to examine what the police officers are doing. As has been said, until we open up and see exactly what police officers are up to, this isn't a fair conversation.
Chief Williams, do you think there's inadequate oversight of the police activities?
Well, I've certainly heard that those comments before, but I can tell you that policing in Ontario specifically is probably one of the most overseen public bodies there is. Several levels of oversight and scrutiny, and the police chiefs have never denied the need for that, and we accept the scrutiny that comes with being a professional policing service. It's a slow process, quite often, the oversight, and we've heard a lot about the Special Investigations Unit and the length of time their investigations take, but there is quite a bit of oversight.
I would like, I guess, Farida to weigh in on that as well. There is, in fact, the SIU, the Special Investigations Unit. You could complain to the Ombudsman as well. Do you think there's adequate oversight of the police in this province?
I don't think so. Especially, from our perspective, we have the Black Legal Action Center offers legal services for folks who have complaints against the police. The majority of our files are related to excessive use of force. And so when our clients come to us, essentially what they're doing is they're saying, let's go to the OIPRD, the Office of the Independent Investigative Director. So the OIPRD is supposed to hold police officers accountable based on the police officer's code of conduct. And oftentimes, if there is something found to be inappropriate, it's referred back to the police service to investigate themselves. And so although there are mechanisms to hold police officers accountable broadly, the question is, how is that done? And so there is a perspective, I think, that feels as though police officers are holding themselves accountable. And so the question would be, is that meaningful? Is that real accountability?
And your answer is no.
No.
Kwasi, what's your answer on that?
Yeah, I think we're very fortunate in Canada and Ontario to have the structures in place that we do at the moment. But I think in some respects, the institutions that we have to foster police don't necessarily have enough teeth or power. They're not always staffed by the right individuals. And I think we still put too much onus on police services themselves to, bring cases to, for example, the SIU, the case of DeFonte Miller, very recently here in the GTA being case in point, one in which an egregious beating of a young Black man came to the attention of the police service that the officer involved worked for, and that service did not bring the case to the SIU. So I think, we have a good structure in place, but there's work that could be done in this respect in this province and this country.
Okay, let me steer our conversation now to how going forward police might be doing things differently. And Chief Williams, I'll start with you again on this one. If there's one area which we hear from the police that they acknowledge they're not the best at and that they might need help at, it's trying to deal with mental health crises. Can you tell us whether or not, over the past year, let's say, the London Police Service has responded to mental health crises in ways different now than they might have 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, I think we're seeing a change, but it's a slow evolution, but it's very important evolution. So just to give you a bit of context, we respond to approximately 3,000 mental crisis calls a year in my community. And about 750 times per year, our officers apprehend an individual under the provisions of the Mental Health Act. And that's not something they choose to do or want to do, but quite often they're the only service available, as I've alluded to, and they're forced into a position. But that's not always the most appropriate response. Anytime somebody is apprehended, then that presents a situation for potential conflict and potential use of force. And let me first say that most of those incidents are resolved peacefully. They are, in fact, de-escalated, and the public often doesn't hear about them. But there are some that do not turn out well, and those are the ones that people hear about. Having said that, what we're moving towards in London and other communities, several have as well, is a co-response model where some of our officers are partnered with a mental health practitioner from the community. Both the officer and the mental health professional would have some specialized training, and they would intervene in those calls for service that may not require a police-led response. They may require police presence or that to be among the menu of options, but it's really a health-led or a community-led response. And our goal is to divert those individuals who are in crisis away from the criminal justice system, away from situations where they need to be apprehended, towards more appropriate community-based responses. And the ultimate goal is to prevent the call from service from occurring in the first place. So the real question is not what we can do for the person at the time, but what could have been done a week ago, a month ago, to prevent that call for service from coming in. So that's the proactive component of the model that I'm talking about. So that's the change that we're moving towards in London, and I think it's very important in the evolution of policing.
Chad, a co-response. How do you like the sounds of that?
I do like the sound of that. A co-response. When I was policing, we took that approach with social services in various scenarios. One of the things that the term detasking has been used, I'll go back to defunding. The chief talks about proactive things. What could have been done a week ago or a month ago? Stripping police budgets, which are in every jurisdiction by far the largest budget a municipality has to deal with. Stripping those budgets back to their core, well, that will provide the funding to allow social services agencies to come in and be proactive. I appreciate the chief's position. I appreciate the initiatives that they're doing. But if he truly wanted to contribute to proactive things in the community that would address these issues, finding ways to cut his budget back so that other agencies can be properly funded would be a great thing to do.
Well, Chad, let me just follow up with you, because if we're talking about a co-response where a police officer shows up, maybe in a supporting or backup role to a mental health professional, it still sounds like you need that officer on that job, and that presumably means you can't defund. Have I got that wrong?
To some degree. So the way it would work now, and the chief can obviously correct this, but when there's a call for service now, if it's not a cooperative response, you would have multiple officers responding. And generally, from an officer safety point of view, if you're going to something where there's potential for an escalation in the physical interaction, multiple officers will attend. If things change and we get to the point where we don't need a police officer to attend, then we can look at defunding. Ambulance calls for service very often have police backup if it's a volatile situation, but there's a process by which call receivers can undertake risk management and determine whether or not police officers need to attend the call. We could do the same thing in mental health calls.
Okay, Farida, let me follow up with you on that. If, in fact, the police officer is still needed to play a supporting role to a mental health professional as both co-respond to a crisis, where's the opportunity for defunding the police in that scenario?
Well, defunding the police is really an intelligent process in which you're assessing who is best equipped to deal with a particular issue. So there is going to be some risk assessment at the upfront. So you're going to have to assess the call, assess what the person's calling for, what the needs are, and whether or not you need an emergency response. Now, it could be that you need an emergency response, and we can talk about later what an emergency response would look like in a defund model. But that doesn't take away the possibility of defunding. Defunding, from our perspective, actually asks us to ask those hard questions on the upfront. So why is this person calling? What kinds of threats are they posing, if at all? And who is best equipped to deal with it?
Okay, I take your point, in which case, I mean, let's follow it up right now. A different kind of emergency response, the likes of which you imagine, as opposed to what's happening right now, what does that look like in your world?
Well, for us, it looks like it's kind of similar to what we have in terms of these mobile crisis early intervention teams that already go around. They're not 24/7. They're essentially mental health nurses who accompany police officers. Police officers are still the first responders. And from our perspective, that's part of the issue. I think about Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and I wonder if you had a mental health nurse respond as opposed to officers who are armed, multiple officers who are armed, would that outcome would that have been different for Ms. Paquette? And I think the answer is potentially yes. So I think that, sometimes when we talk about defunding police, folks think that it's sort of like a sort of messy, sloppy process, when it's really about looking at police budgets, seeing where those funds are allocated, and seeing if they can be better funded and better allocated in the hope of preserving Black life and Indigenous life. And so I envision an emergency response team that is not completely different from what we have now, but just removing the police officer as being the first responder, I think that would go a long way in terms of building some community trust and faith when someone calls and they're in a crisis.
Just before I get others to comment on that, we should, just by way of background, say the Korchinski-Paquette situation was a woman in crisis in Toronto's West End who ran out onto her balcony and in an attempt to jump to another balcony didn't make it and tragically fell to her death. I think the police would want me to say that the family called the police in. The police were there because the family called them in. And I guess there is some kind of debate, maybe Akwasi come in here on this, there may be some kind of debate as to whether or not the presence of uniforms exacerbated the situation. There was an investigation of it, and there was no suggestion at all that the police played any role in her death. Now, that's the official story. Akwasi, if you want to pick it up and make your comments, now's the time.
So, of course, recent events here in Toronto in relation to people in mental health crisis and also instances of social unrest. The presence of police officers with uniforms, with guns, with their vehicles can certainly exacerbate situations and lead to death, perhaps as they did in the Regis Korchinski-Paquette situation. But I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge here that hasn't yet been discussed is the preventative aspect of this detasking and defunding conversation, because basically we've got ourselves into the situation we're in now with the police responding to so many different types of social problems precisely because funding has been cut from other social areas, right? Mental health, homelessness, youth programming. And so by taking the funds away from the police and giving them back to those other social institutions, organizations, and agencies, the hopes would also be that would have a preventative effect so that the police wouldn't actually need to respond to, nor would another agency need to respond to so many mental health crises, so many people experiencing homelessness, to issues related to drug use and the likes, because there would be less presence of that in our society and on our streets at the front end rather than the back end, which is largely what the police end up doing.
You're talking about upstream versus downstream problems, and I totally take your point, which takes us back to Chief Williams. As we consider detasking the police services of this province, Chief Williams, maybe put this on the table. What are the things that we absolutely need the police to do for which there are no other alternative agencies or services in your view?
Well, I think it goes back to the core responsibilities of police services, which is legislated, and a lot of it's pretty obvious. It's law enforcement, it's emergency response, crime prevention, assisting victims, and things like that. And the police officers in Ontario are very, very well trained and very well equipped to do these things, and by and large do an amazing job. They serve their communities well, and the vast majority of incidents, like I've indicated, are resolved peacefully, and they're resolved professionally, and we have to keep that in mind. So those core services are still required, and anytime we do any type of public survey, we consistently receive that information that they want the police presence in neighborhoods for that preventative sense and that safety and security feeling, and they want us to have the ability to respond 24/7 when somebody calls 911. I think that will forever remain, and that's what the communities want. So it's the other areas that we talked about, the health issues, the homelessness issues that fall upon the police, again, because quite often nobody else is answering the call in many communities. And we do need to detask the police of those issues.
We're about 4 minutes to go here, and Farida, let me get you to follow up on that. Do you agree with Chief Williams' list of what we absolutely, positively, at a bare minimum, need the police to do in this province on a day-to-day basis?
I respectfully disagree. I think that, from our perspective, this conversation is not just about defunding, but reimagining policing. I think the question that we have to ask ultimately is, can we imagine a society where we do have community policing, we have public safety, but in a way that is done where we don't have armed police officers who are involved in the sense that they are responding to things that they may not be equipped to do. So from our perspective, it's not just about defunding, it's about reimagining policing. And I think that there is a difficulty in reimagining policing because we live in a society society that is predicated in many ways in looking to police in times of crises. And so what we're asking people to do is think about alternatives. Are there alternative models that we can look to, other jurisdictions that we can look to, where policing is happening in a way that folks aren't potentially in harm's way? I think of the UK. I think of jurisdictions where police officers aren't armed, for example. That is one step to that in that conversation, to progress that conversation.
Chad Haggerty, does that suggestion as part of a reimagined police package, does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ms. Adam hit the nail on the head. Chief William came in, wasn't wearing his uniform because he understands that that creates a certain response. Yet when he's asked, how should we detask? He lists essentially everything that police do now. When police try to reimagine policing, they imagine it in the same context that it always has been. Civilian oversight, civilian interaction, and civilian direction is something that we need to seriously consider and begin doing.
Stephen Williams, can you imagine your officers doing their jobs without carrying firearms?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that's feasible right now, given the way the legislation is and the calls for service that they're required to attend to. We have a number of officers who are not in uniform, and the mental health model that I spoke about, we didn't get into the details, but does not involve uniform officers. So we're very alive to that issue. But I think the reality is that there are weapons on the streets. There are criminals on the streets who the public expects us to deal with when we're called, and police officers need to be trained and equipped to do so. That doesn't mean that other officers can't do crime prevention functions and education and awareness and proactive work, and that's happening now.
Kwasi and I here, can you imagine a reimagined police service where weapons are not carried?
I can. Not carried by all officers, perhaps. Even in the United Kingdom, there are, of course, rapid response teams that are armed, and they do at times, and it's much more rare than in Canada, end up shooting individuals, some of whom are also themselves unarmed. But I do think, and we had this conversation a year and a half or so ago, I think we need to drastically reimagine how we engender public safety, community safety, and what policing is. Policing is something that has existed within our societies now for millennia. And the policing that we have now is a product of our time. It does not have to be a product of our future. And I think we need to think as communities, as societies, and as institutions about how we, moving forward, engender public safety in a way that includes some kind of law enforcement agency, but also, I think, puts greater emphasis on other social institutions, organizations, and importantly on us as citizens in a society.
I want to thank Kwasi Owusu-Bempah from the U of T, Farida Adam from Black Legal Action Centre, Stephen Williams, the Chief of Police for the City of London, and Chad Haggerty, the former RCMP officer, now a student at law, for a really smart and civilized discussion here on TVO tonight. Thanks so much, all four of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It can sound like science fiction, but what's known as algorithmic policing is already in use in Ontario. A camera reads your license plate going through a red light, for example. But that may change as police forces consider expanding the use of technology, perhaps even to do what's called predictive policing. A recent report from the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab raised some red flags about where it could go wrong. With us for a closer look, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Ryan Prox, an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University School of Criminology and officer in charge of crime analytics for Vancouver's police department. And the co-authors of that report in Ottawa, Cynthia Koo, research fellow at the Citizen Lab and a technology and human rights lawyer. And in downtown Toronto, Kate Robertson, a criminal lawyer at Marks & Law and a research fellow at U of T's Citizen Lab. Welcome all.
Happy to be here.
So,
thank you.
This is sounds pretty advanced, sounds like it's out of a movie. Cynthia, what is algorithmic policing?
Algorithmic policing is our term to encompass a wide range of technologies, which generally speaking use mass data processing in order to draw inferences to inform policing decisions, or alternatively to automate surveillance at a scale unprecedented to us before.
Kate, I'm going to bring you in here. What could that look like when we talk about algorithmic policing?
Well, algorithmic technology, when used in policing, tends to turn traditional methods of policing on their head by either extrapolating case-specific surveillance activities to a massive scale to capture wide segments of the population who may, or in all likelihood, are not under any type of active investigation or suspicion of wrongdoing. Or alternatively, another type of technology called predictive policing is trying to, sometimes with mixed success or unsuccess, draw patterns from historic police data in order to predict where or when or who may be involved with future crime that may not ever happen.
Now, Ryan, you're a police officer yourself. How does this technology differ from traditional police methods?
There's a bit of miscommunication and a bit of sensationalism that comes to bear when we're talking about predictive, or I don't like to use the term predictive. I prefer to use the term crime forecasting when you're talking about making specifically geospatial forecasts of areas. So when we talk about crime forecasting, what we're talking about is police have been doing what's been called hotspot policing for 30, 40 years. It's basically before the day of computers, you used to put pins on a map, evolved to computers, kind of did hotspots, which is like a color-coded intensity of where crime is. And crime forecasting is kind of the next evolution of that, where instead of using yesterday's data, where we look at what happened yesterday and we're going to try and deploy our police resources tomorrow, we're looking at what's happening almost in a real-time scenario and try and allocate the resources more efficiently and effectively. So there's no kind of minority report component to it. It's just a more efficient use of police resources, which as a citizen, I'd like to see the police being deployed more effectively.
Now, Kate, you write in your report that the historical and social context in the criminal justice system is important in understanding this type of policing. How come?
Well, actually, I very much agree with Ryan that sometimes this type of technology is mislabeled. And in some respects, it's not a new proposition to deploy police resources to for example, neighborhoods on a proactive basis in the hopes of somehow deterring crime. But what we've called attention to in our report is that the law enforcement services in Canada have also been associated with discriminatory practices that has resulted in the overrepresentation of marginalized groups, racialized communities, and Indigenous communities in policing data. And so what our concern in the introduction of algorithms into this dynamic is that it can perpetuate these types of discriminatory biases under a scientific veneer that really hides what's going on and can result in the continuation of adverse effects through proactive policing that are already being in communities.
I want to pick up on that. Cynthia, do you have any examples of what those fears may look like when we talk about algorithmic policing discriminating against marginalized communities?
Sure. We have no shortage of examples when it comes to this sort of discrimination from looking at other jurisdictions, most particularly the United States. For example, we know of predictive policing programs happening in Chicago with the Chicago Police Department Strategic Subject List and in the Los Angeles Police Department with Operation Laser, both of which, it's really worth noting, have been shut down within the past 1 or 2 years due to finding that they weren't effective, that they had questionable data practices, that there wasn't enough oversight. And what we saw happening with these programs was that police were being sent disproportionately to Black and Latinx communities, for example, to other marginalized communities. Other examples involve risk assessment algorithms, which purport to predict whether someone is likely or not to engage in future crime, regardless of whether that actually happens or not. So probably the most well-known example is the COMPAS algorithm used in the corrections context in the United States, which ProPublica found, I think, falsely flagged Black defendants at almost twice the rate of white defendants. So I would echo Kate in saying that we actually agree with Ryan when it comes to the language, and we actually try to move towards the language of forecasting in our report, because predictive policing, in some way, it's a marketing term by the vendors of this sort of technology, and it does overstate the level of certainty and knowledge that this software can actually give. And so it's trying to find that balance between moving to what we think is a more accurate way of talking about this technology and also using the term that unfortunately to some extent has been popularized so people know what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change what's actually happening, which is using algorithms to draw statistical generalized inferences for the purposes of making criminal justice decisions about specific individuals.
Now, Ryan, Cynthia mentioned our neighbors to the south, the U.S. For some examples of using that technology, we can also look at countries like China. How does Canada differ from their use of technology from those countries?
And that's a really important point. Most of the points that Cynthia brought up in regards to the American context, I actually agree with the concerns and the issues that have cropped up in the States. But within the Canadian milieu, we've very much been watching what's been happening there and been trying to avoid a lot of the pitfalls and shortcomings that the Americans. Operation Laser and LAPD, that it spurned a grassroots organization called Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which was very instrumental in getting the laser program abolished. So within the Canadian context, I don't see as much of a parallel. We don't have the same militarization of the police in Canada. We have more of a community-based approach versus what you see in the United States. As well, we have a different legislative and oversight framework in Canada. We have, for example, privacy commissioners throughout each province, and the privacy commissioners take a very keen eye to any activities that the police engage in where they're doing any sort of data collection or using data in an aggregate level. As well as the federal government, back in April of 2019, they implemented the Automated Data Processing Directive, which only applies to federal government entities, but it does put a framework for doing a risk assessment. They have the automated impact or the algorithmic impact assessment framework, which evaluates the veracity of the algorithms themselves, looks for inherent biases, and requires the vendor to actually submit their algorithms to the federal government technical specialist for review. So we do have a different environment in Canada than where it's more the Wild West in the States.
So I'm curious, this may sound like a foolish question here. It's used in the States, it's used in countries like China, we're starting to use it in Canada. But Kate, is any of this legal?
Well, sometimes when it comes to the question of legality, you're talking about a moving target. It has to be that way for a good reason, because our human rights law and our Constitution by design has to keep up and remain meaningful despite a changing technological landscape. But what we've called attention to is that some of the big ticket questions, like is this technology creating intrusive impacts on privacy in Canada? Is it discriminatory? There are significant questions that remain unanswered, and we do have a number of findings that suggest that some uses of this technology is incompatible with our Constitution. But we've also called attention to the need for bringing the oversight system in Canada into the 21st century. And from a question of legality, sometimes the very absence of oversight and regulatory oversight can create an illegal situation. And so I have to actually disagree with Ryan that Canada has a meaningful level of check and balance when it comes to controversial and experimental technologies in Canada. Too often we're seeing that police services view some of the oversight mechanisms as optional and discretionary, and the public learns about controversial technology being deployed long after the fact, when really the public does have a right to know. It's a matter of public concern, and they may have an opportunity and a value add in providing input on what kind of regulations are needed to supervise very controversial technologies. And if I could put it in contrast, from a real perspective, when you're talking about big data techniques, Canada's national security institutions are actually more regulated than police services in Canada, which quite frankly makes no sense.
I want to pick up on that with Ryan. Do we know, do police use this technology to arrest, charge, and have we gotten convictions out of this?
Well, I would argue that we look at, there's different subsets within algorithmic policing. Now, if you look at it from a predictive policing or forecasting, as I mentioned, it basically deploys the police in a more efficient use. If you look at more of the risk areas, such as artificial intelligence or machine learning enabled technologies like facial recognition, that's something where within the Canadian context, that's very very limited applications, and it's considered a very high-risk area for law enforcement to go into. And I don't see that we're using the tech. We're very circumspect on how we use the technology in Canada because of the inherent risks on it. And I do foresee what the federal government has done, and the Treasury Board specifically, with the automated decision-making directive in April of 2019. I do see that kind of as a framework of moving forward to give greater oversight at the provincial level, so provincial law enforcement and other provincial government entities themselves will have some sort of guidelines and best practices in place, because to be candid, that isn't in existence. We have guidelines and we do look to the federal government to adhere to them, but there is no provincial legislative framework that has an enforcement provision. So I think that's something that I agree with my learned colleagues. That's something that should move forward and be in place and kind of have clearer lines of engagement for how police should use more advanced technology.
Cynthia, is there any concern that this technology will be used to surveil people who are just living their lives?
Absolutely. That is one of our main sources of concern, that this technology will be used in an overbroad and overreaching way to survey people living their lives, or especially to survey people who are trying to improve their rights through seeking equality and civil rights, for example. We know when it comes to social media surveillance, particularly, for example, that the Canadian law enforcement has a track record of surveilling different types of social movements. For example, Cindy Blackstock, a First Nations human rights defender, was found to have had her social media profile spied on by the federal government. We know that the RCMP was using Social Studio in a project known as Project Wide Awake to survey people for around 2 years before the public found out, due to the Tyee breaking that story. Similarly, we know that the Toronto Police Services was using facial recognition, again, for over a year before the public knew, again, due to media breaking that story. And so it's that concern of turning our public forums of expression, whether that's virtual forums such as social media, or public physical forums such as attending protests, that we are concerned about the surveillance risk. And we know this happens because the vendors themselves, for example, Media Sonar, which is based in London, Ontario, was banned from Twitter and Facebook and Instagram because it was promoting its services for policing, for surveilling Black Lives Matter hashtags on social media to police services, for example. And the RCMP has said that they want to use social media to engage in proactive monitoring, which again is predictive or forecasting. It's not in the context of an ongoing investigation where crime has already happened. So there's something particularly pernicious about the idea that by virtue of being a marginalized group actively engaged in trying to fight for your equality and civil rights, you might bring that sort of police scrutiny upon you when someone else might not, which of course would be a violation of the rights to freedom of expression.
I want to talk about the Vancouver Police Department. They use a program called Geodash. Ryan, can you tell us what does that program do?
It's the next evolution of hotspot policing. So it forecasts residential break and enters 24 hours in advance, gives 2-hour intervals where it forecasts 6 locations that have a higher probability. Again, I hazard to say predictions, but a higher probability of encountering an incident. So with that, we can deploy our resources or notify through Block Watch neighborhoods that are at a higher risk factor identified within a 2-hour interval, that there's a greater potential for them to encounter a property crime incident, such as residential break and enters. Having said that, I think it is important to mention we don't use police-generated data. We've gone to significant lengths to kind of hedge against a lot of the things that Cynthia is bringing up that have been identified in the U.S. as problematic. So we only use citizen-generated data. So if you call and report that your house was burglarized, we use that data. If a police officer identifies through proactive enforcement that there's some sort of nefarious or criminal activity, we exclude that from the algorithm to at least hedge against algorithmic bias seeping into the system. As well, we have exclusionary zones for forecasting around sensitive areas. For example, our downtown east side, we have an exclusionary zone because it's considered one of the more marginalized communities in the city of Vancouver. So we don't deploy resources within those areas based on crime forecasting. We have specialized units that deal with community outreach within the downtown east side. So there's no net benefit to overlapping that with crime forecasting.
Now, has the program led to a reduction in crime?
significant. During our 6-month pilot project, we saw reductions month over month between 5 to 27% reductions in property crime, with our deployed resources being proactively engaged with the forecasting locations. Put that in context. Typical traditional policing proactive measures, if we see reductions of 5%, we consider that a high success. Having reductions of 21 to 27%, which we saw in some of the summer months, is unheard of. So we did see significant improvements and reductions in residential break and enters when the program was piloted.
Now, Cynthia, I want to ask you about a little bit about transparency and putting this report together. How open are police about using this technology with the public, and what was that process like putting the report together?
Well, it really ran across the gamut depending on the particular police department or federal or provincial department that we were speaking to. Some departments like Ryan and the VPD were actually quite forthcoming with us, and others, mostly police services in Ontario, I'd have to say were almost the complete opposite. With respect to filing freedom of information requests, for example, we ran into multiple barriers in trying to obtain information and details, whether it was extraordinarily high processing fees. For example, one service quoted us about $9,000 to process that freedom of information request, which we couldn't proceed with. Others claimed various statutory exceptions, whether it was third-party commercial interest, cabinet confidentiality, for example. There were long processing delays. So I think the RCMP told us that it would be about 2 years before they could fulfill our request. So needless to say, that information did not make it into our report. The Alberta Ministry of Justice told us that they found some 200 pages of information that were responsive to our request, but they were withholding them because of, again, statutory exemptions. So there's just all this information out there to the extent that we know our report, what's in there is really the tip of the iceberg. And that's why one of our first recommendations is to call for full disclosure and transparency on the part of police agencies across Canada, so we actually know what the full factual landscape is and then can make those critical legal policy and regulatory decisions based on knowing the facts.
So the report has been out for a month. What's the reaction been so far from law enforcement?
Well, in some ways, it's very early to be able to see what the reaction has been. I mean, in some ways, we've already known going into this report in the research stages that law enforcement representatives, including Ryan and others, are cognizant of the human rights dangers that are at stake. But nevertheless, we've called attention to the fact that we need more information than the sort of the basic fact that this algorithm is being used or not in order to discern its human rights effects. And so, for example, when you insert an algorithm into a complex social problem, it can be sometimes difficult to discern what's happening and why. So Ryan had mentioned a few moments ago that crime statistics had been declining during the pilot project of the Vancouver algorithm. However, generally, nationwide in Canada over the last 20 years, we saw year after year declines in property crime rates generally. So it's hard to know whether that's larger forces at work or the algorithm itself. The same kind of context is needed for the human rights impacts, and where we differ from some of our colleagues in law enforcement who are experimenting with these technologies is that it may not be possible to actually mitigate the use of an algorithm in order to prevent the human rights dangers. And so when we've seen that potentially there may or may not be an effect, a positive effect with the use of algorithms, but we do know that proactive policing in community does cause adverse effects for particularly youth and racialized communities. Proactive detentions and stops in the communities have been linked to mental health adverse effects, employment effects, and other larger social harm regarding the deterioration of the relationship between police and communities. So there are important questions that still do need to be answered, and we look forward to continuing to see the report attract public attention about the call for need for regulation and clear limits.
Ryan, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that response there.
Well, there's quite a bit there. I would argue that about 3 years ago, just as a criminologist, we saw most property crime and violent crime kind of hit rock bottom. And generally speaking, in Canada, we've seen that starting to ramp back up again. There's been incremental increases across the board in violent crime, offenses against the person, and property crime. So I would argue that that downward 20 to 30-year trend that we've been seeing, and for the most part, law enforcement has taken a lot of credit for that, it's been inching upward again. In terms of the transparency and accountability, I couldn't agree with that more. I think one of the biggest issues is that a lot of these things are not done with full disclosure to the public. That's something with the Vancouver Police we've made great effort to try and address. For example, we've had town hall meetings. I've given presentations at the BC Civil Liberties Association on the use of the technology. So they weren't finding out about it within the community by freedom of information requests by the media. We actually got out and proactively engaged with the community, announced what we were doing, and we're available to present on that and answer questions to try and alleviate any fears. Because a lot of people, when they think of this technology, they might think of Minority Report or kind of science fiction movies. And I actually think what's happening with the report that's currently out is that it engages a discussion around a topic that usually is kind of sidelined and not foremost in people's minds, and there's a lot of unknowns and disinformation around that. So having a dialogue around this topic, I think, is extremely important. And equally important, I agree with my learned colleagues that we should have some sort of regulatory framework that just sets up the rules of engagement so that everybody's operating on the same page, and there's an accountability metric in place so that there's no potential or perceptions that the police are doing anything nefarious with the technology.
And with that, I think that's where we're going to have to leave it for today. But I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. That is Cynthia Koo, Kate Robertson, and Ryan Prox. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, September 29th, 2020. After tonight's U.S. presidential debate, tomorrow we'll speak to some American expats who are closely watching the race there, but from here. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.